Welcome to the Vantage HR Influencers Podcast. This podcast is sponsored by Vantage Circle, the leading employee benefits and engagement platform.
Hi everyone, this is Rohit from Vantage Influencers Podcast, and today I'm excited to have Jason Lauritsen, who's a keynote speaker, author, advisor, and leadership trainer who's worked with companies like Quantum Workplace, Union Bank and Trust, and West Corporation, among others. Jason is known as a workplace evangelist who's passionate about his work and is the best-selling author of the book, Unlocking High Performance. Welcome to the show, Jason.
Thanks for having me.
Awesome. So Jason, how did you get into HR and what got you excited to be in this space of HR?
Well, I think like a lot of people, I didn't know that I wanted to be in HR. When I started my career, I kind of found my way into it or was called into it, I guess. My early career was, I started actually as a salesperson of all things, and sales led me to eventually into recruiting, and I became a recruiter, like a third-party recruiter. And as I was doing that work, obviously I was working with HR people a lot of times, but as I was doing that work, I had the opportunity to see inside of organizations. You know, you're talking to people about their jobs, you're talking to people or organizations about, why people are leaving, why people would come. You're talking to individuals about why they want to go to someplace to work or what they're looking for. And what I noticed in that conversation or in those conversations was a lot of dysfunction. It seemed like work wasn't working very well. Like people were leaving, there was stuff broken that was causing people to leave. You talk to people about jobs and they were describing all sorts of terrible things that were happening to them at work. And eventually I got really interested in the relationship between people and their work and kind of the dynamics that exist there. And I guess I was puzzled as to why it wasn't working very well for so many people. And I think that's what ultimately drew me into corporate HR, getting into the human resources business, was that I wanted to be able to do something about it. I wanted to be able to try to be part of fixing it. And so that kind of once I made that jump, the rest is history. I was always interested in the leadership and human behavior and all of those kinds of disciplines. I was fascinated in that. And so once I found my way into HR and could kind of bring it all together and have an impact on the experience people were having, I was hooked, and sort of the rest is history, I guess.
Right, got it. You're a work evangelist. You often talk about work as a relationship and not a contract. How can new age leaders look at, we're recording in the middle of the COVID crisis, right? So how can employees be valued, and, how can we build a culture where this work is looked at as a relationship and not track between employer and employee?
Sure. Well, I think that's a big question to answer because there's a whole bunch of layers to that. But I think fundamentally, when you recognize, and this was one of the moments in my career where things started to come into focus as to where and how we could fix this work relationship I was talking about, was recognizing that all of the employee engagement data we have tells us that employees are really driven by, engagement, I should say, is really driven by things like feeling valued at work and feeling cared for and trusted and appreciated and recognized. And these are all relational constructs. They're things that generally exist in the context of a relationship with other human beings. And so when we think about how do we fix this in the employee-employee relationship, it's about thinking about, instead of treating work through the lens of, like you mentioned, in a contract, like what have you done for me lately? Most of our HR programs and processes are designed around making sure that employees are getting the work done and that they're living up to their end of the bargain and all this stuff. But when you think about it through the lens of what employees are looking for, what they need, this relational stuff, it's about thinking, how do we treat people in the work relationship? How do we treat people at work more like it is a relationship, that there's a two-way relationship going on, and having the same considerations we would of any other relationship. So it's asking for feedback more often. It is, being in conversation, like two-way conversation more often, having, really listening to what people are saying to you. It's making sure that people are feeling seen and valued and appreciated for the work that they do, for the effort that they put forth for the organization. It's pretty fundamental, simple things that make someone feel good about the relationship. But often those are the kinds of things we overlook because we're so busy trying to enforce our programs, making sure that people are, hitting that metric today. And it's all about what have you done for me lately and making sure we're checking all the boxes for your performance. And performance is important, obviously. But if over time I don't feel like you care about me and the relationship is broken, I'm not going to perform as well. I'm not going to want to perform as well for you. And so we have to really put that relationship first to make sure people are feeling that connection to work and to the people they work with and for in order to do their best.
Interesting. You pointed about feedback, and I want to talk about how to give effective feedback to employees, without sounding too critical. Because if the feedback is too critical, how should a leader approach giving feedback to their employees or to their team members?
The thing with feedback that is really interesting is that for some reason we've decided over the last several decades in work management or the management of people at work that feedback needs to be critical, or that we're mostly focused on looking backwards at what you did yesterday, last week, last year, and telling you all the things that you did wrong and the things you need to fix. The problem with that is that there's a whole bunch of social science that tells us that that's just not an effective way to motivate performance improvement or behavior change. I think the key in doing this right is adopting a very different mindset. And I think this is why we've been hearing a lot about coaching in the context of work and how managers should show up in their job or think about their job as more as a coach than a manager. And this really sunk in for me when I think about my own experiences. Like I think back about having coaches, the best coaches that I had, and the example I often point to is a number of years ago, I hired a golf coach to try to help me play a little bit better golf. And I'm not a great golfer, I never have been, but I needed to play golf well enough to play for business reasons and everything else. So I hired a golf coach, and I went out with this guy, and we went out to hit golf balls. And the thing that was really interesting is that we got there and he just said, now go up and hit some balls. And so I was hitting golf balls, standing up there, and he was watching me. And then what he would do is he'd watch me swing, and he'd say, hey, he said, next time before your next swing, he's like, let's talk about your grip a little bit. And then he would give me kind of a piece of advice, or he'd give me some guidance. And he said, just try that and see how that goes. And then I'd swing a couple more times, and that might hit, or he might ask me a question, like when one went haywire, he'd be like, what happened there, do you think? Like, what were you thinking about? Or what did you feel when you hit that ball? And then he'd say, well, next time let's try this, or think about this right before. And the thing that I realized is not once during that entire process did he ask me about like how I'd played in the past. He was never critical of my swing. He was never telling me what I was doing wrong. The only thing he was focused on was helping it give me helpful guidance on how to perform better in the future. And when you think about that, and I think about every coach I've ever had, really the good coaches, that's what they're doing. I mean, they might help bring your attention to something that's not working very well, but they're not going to spend a bunch of time criticizing you over something that you did, on the last play, because we can't change that. That's already gone. Coaches know that their job is to change and optimize how you perform on the next play or in the next game or in the future. And so when we recognize like that's what coaching is, coaching's about improving performance, optimizing performance, you start to realize, well, approach wise, then I need to take a different approach. And I think the best way that I've seen this articulated that I think comes into the workplace is using an approach. I use the term, I didn't invent this term. It's been used by several other people before me. The first person is Marshall Goldsmith that I saw use it, but it's a phrase called feed forward. And feed forward is the idea that instead of feedback being critical about past performance, feed forward notices past performance, but then provides advice and suggestions towards future improvement. So I'll give you an example. If I had someone at work that I was consulting or that I was coaching or managing, and let's say they had to present, or they presented a new idea, or they were presenting a report or a concept or something to a team meeting, and they botched the presentation, right? Did a couple things really poorly. Feedback would say, I need to call them into my office, be very specific about the things they did wrong and what the impact was of those things, and then tell them or help them figure out what they should do differently in the future. That's feedback. It focuses, though, on criticism, which triggers defensive reactions and all sorts of things. Feed forward would look like saying, hey, would you be interested in, I had a few thoughts or ideas about things that you could do on your next presentation to help you. Just wanted to give them to you, but so that you have them. So next time you present, you can use them if you want. You'd invite them into that. They'd say, sure, I'd love to hear that, because most people love to hear suggestions. They don't like criticism, but they love suggestions. And then the feedback would sound something like, hey, this morning, one of the things I got to thinking about as you were presenting is a lot of times when I do presentations, I like to start my presentation by outlining the agenda very specifically so that people know what I'm going to cover and set expectations for them. That might be helpful for you in managing this. Or, one of the things that's really effective when you're presenting is to make sure that you're, pacing how quickly you're presenting, because when you speak too quickly, people can't understand, sometimes can't understand. There were times where I felt like the pacing maybe was faster. So next time you might want to think about trying, it's that kind of stuff. But the idea is I'm helping them with suggestions for next time they do this. And when you do that, instead of being defensive, it's more about them it's not taken defensively. It's taken more as like, oh, that's an interesting coaching tip that I can now put in, and I'm more likely to take that in, internalize it, and use it. So that would be that's the approach that I tend to coach.
Really great examples about coaching and giving suggestions to people so that they can look at improving the performance in future. And I want to understand how do we design work experience for employees so that their work relationship is optimized. Everybody in the company would have different needs. Somebody would want more flexible work timings, or somebody would want someone is more ambitious, or somebody has different desires. But how do we design work experience for company as large as 10,000 employees, or company as small as 100 employees, for a leader? How do we go about creating that right culture?
Well, I think there's some great lessons we can learn from just studying the design process itself. I think you used that was the optimal word there, is design, is to really understand that design is about creating with intention, and very specifically, it's about creating with intention for the person that it's for. And so designers know that their first step in any design process is they have to go study and really get to know the people that they're designing for. And I think that's a lot of times where we fall down, is we make assumptions about our employees and what they want and what they need and all of that. And you're right, there are all sorts of different, different various needs based on each individual. But I think in general, it depends on the scale you're designing for. If I'm a manager or a leader and I'm thinking about my team, then I need to be in conversations with my team to understand what their needs are, what are the specific things that are most important to them. I can understand that then in the context of what I have within my responsibility or scope of my scope of authority that I can do, and then I can sort of bring those two things together to create as the best situation for my employees as we can. So you talk about flexibility. If within my responsibility as a leader, I can create whatever work scheduling for my people I want, as long as the work gets done. I mean, if I'm in that kind of an environment, then I'm going to work with my people, and I can work with my people individually to figure out what works best for them, make sure they're crystal clear on what's expected in terms of outcomes, and then helping them figure out a schedule that works best for them, that they can work and finish, get their work done in the best way that suits them. So at a team level, you can do that. At an organizational level, it's a little bit broader, because it's kind of then like thinking about designing products, being like a product designer at a consumer electronics organization, where yes, you can't design a product that's going to meet every consumer's needs perfectly, but you need to go, if you go then talk to a broad enough group of your employees to understand what their needs are and identify common needs, or the needs that seem to be common, or the wants and desires that seem to be common amongst your employees. And then once you understand those needs and can articulate them, then you can start building workplace culture and processes and programs around those needs, or to understand how to meet those needs broadly. You're not going to get it perfect for everybody, but if you actually get to know your people and what matters to them first, and what, the things that really matter to them, you're going to be a lot farther ahead than most organizations that just generally write rules based on what's been done in the past or what they assume people want. But start by really, really knowing your people.
Got it. Yeah. Knowing people is very important, especially as a team leader. And common elements which are found in these best places to work, and what can they tell us how to create most engaging workplaces if you want to implicate, imbibe all those value systems and culture from these best places to work?
Well, at its foundation, generally when I unpack this for people, and I think it's a great question, and it's a common question that people want to know, is what do they do? What do these organizations do differently that positions them to win this accolades for best places to work? The three things that I boil it down to is that they're, and I think probably, I don't know if it's this order of importance, but the very first one that you see is they're really dedicated to creating clarity. And that's all about communication. When I was studying and looking at best places to work during my time at Quantum Workplace, I had we talk to organizations and look at practices to try to understand how they were getting these outcomes. And one of the things that you'd see over and over and over and over again is they were relentless about communication.
Right.
And communication was, it's not just pushing information out like we often think about with corporate communication. They were constantly in sort of two-way communication. So they were sharing information. There was transparency and sharing of information by leaders and managers. But there was also this opportunity for employees to be asking questions and providing feedback. And so it was an ongoing kind of conversation at an organizational level, and you'd see that all the time. So that was probably the biggest thing, is those organizations were in that feedback loop, or in that conversation constantly with employees. The other two we've hinted at a little bit are sort of relational. The second one was really that they foster connection at all levels. They're really serious about making sure that people, feel a strong sense of connectedness with their peers, with their manager, and they create space for that to happen, right? They make room for people to really socially connect, become close with those people they work with. And the last piece of it is that they really go out of their way to make sure their employees feel the love, that they feel appreciated and recognized and acknowledged. Like they're really, generally they have systems and processes and rituals in place to make sure that people really feel like the organization cares about them and really values the impact they have on the organization. And so those are the three things that tend to bubble to the top when you look into these organizations and what they're doing differently.
Got it. And what are the best ways to hack employee engagement? What practical advice would you give to leaders to get more engagement from their employees?
Well, I think of this as a hack because it's something that is It's small, it's easy to do. Every manager or supervisor on the planet can do it, and it doesn't get used often enough, is to sit down and ask your people, right? Ask them about their work experience. Ask them questions like, what could we do as a team to help make the work experience on a day-to-day basis feel better for you, or to make working here feel more energizing. A manager also, another question a manager could ask is, what could I do to be more supportive to you in your work? Or how could I be a better manager for you? It's questions like that, just going straight at it, or, even simple, go back to the list I just shared, how can, well, let's think of it like, if I think about appreciation, what's the best way I can show appreciation to you, or show you that you are doing a great job? Like, how do you prefer to hear that, or what would be the best way to do that? Or asking a question like, what is the best recognition you've ever gotten at work for some of your work that you feel really good about? What's your favorite recognition you've gotten? When you ask questions like that of employees, they will tell you. And if you stay in conversations like that periodically through one-on-ones and that sort of thing, that's really important. So that, just fundamentally go ask your people about their experience, listen closely. They will tell you what needs to be done, and then do those things, right? Or find a way to try to meet those needs. The other thing I just hinted at is the one-on-one meeting between managers and employees. If that's the easiest and fastest way to improve engagement. If your organization isn't requiring those who supervise people to be having a structured one-on-one conversation or meeting with each member of their team at least monthly, then start there, because that one-on-one meeting is probably the most effective tool you have. And if your managers aren't skilled at this, then give them some kind of a simple framework, give them a few questions to start with, much like what I just shared, and coach the managers that their job in that one-on-one is to ask questions and listen and provide support and coaching, as opposed to talk at the employee. If you do those things, those two things are probably the fastest and best, let's call them hacks or techniques you can use to improve engagement, and they work almost overnight if you start using them right away.
Right, yeah, you're absolutely right. One-on-one conversation with your team member or team leader is a very effective way to understand the needs of what the team wants. And are there any metrics which HR leaders should use to measure employee engagement? What if there's a disengaged employee? How would they get to understand that who's engaged employee and who's disengaged? What metrics would you suggest for people to measure these employee engagement?
Well, in the question, it sounds there's two questions implied, I guess, in what you just asked. One is just general metrics, and the other is like, what do you do, or how do you know if you have a disengaged employee?
Correct. Yeah.
So on the first, the metrics. So there's two answers to that I'll give. The quick answer is, if you're looking for a really powerful singular measurement to understand in general where your engagement is and be able to compare it externally to other companies, the employee net promoter score is becoming kind of, I think, the standard metric. If it's a singular item, it's a really powerful tool. It's not enough to transform your culture or really be the basis of any kind of major ongoing engagement measure. If you want to really, understand what's going on and fix it, it's not diagnostic, but it will tell you where you're at. So employee net promoter score is that would be the suggestion for a singular measure at a high level. As far as how do you measure engagement or metrics otherwise, a lot of that has to do with how you define and think about engagement at your organization. And the problem we often have is organizations don't take the time to really get clear about what they mean when they talk about engagement. It's like, well, we've been reading some articles, we know that engagement's important, And so now we want to measure it and do something. Well, it's like, what exactly does engagement mean at your organization? When you say engagement, what does that look like? How does that drive your business? What impact does it have on your organization? Because until you answer those questions, it's really hard to get a clear idea of how to measure it effectively. And so it starts with definition, and then you can use things like surveys and other feedback mechanisms to go out and make sure that what you are defining, what you expect or what you're looking for in engagement is actually happening. You can get feedback that way. So start with definition. And that's often, like I said, surveys can be really effective in measuring it once you're clear on that. The second half of your question, as far as disengaged employees, is, I think it's oftentimes that's less, as far as measuring it, you don't necessarily need a metric to tell you often that an employee is disengaged, particularly if you're clear about what it means, because you'll see, they're probably not performing optimally. They might be performing okay, but they're not behaving, their behavior isn't consistent with what you're saying an engaged employee is. An engaged employee is someone who really cares about their work, someone who's sort of leaning in and who's raising their hand to do more, to help, to build, to grow, to be part of forward momentum. They're putting energy into the system as opposed to taking energy out. They provide suggestions versus criticism, those kinds of things. That's part of how you're defining engagement. It's generally on an individual level, it's fairly straightforward to recognize those behaviors and then coach them up or out. But that would be kind of a very quick answer to that question.
Got it. And Jason, you've written a popular book which is Unlocking High Performance, and you also run your coaching business, and you've started Employee Engagement Leader Community. What is that community all about, and how are you using a different resources and assets to help out other HR leaders?
I'm excited about the community. We just launched it in June. And basically the reason that I launched it was that, especially in this, this time in history, I think employee engagement and understanding how to evolve employee engagement is more important than it's ever been. And I wanted to find a way to provide a resource and support and kind of group coaching and a network that would support HR leaders in their journey to improve their organization, but be able to do it in a way that was cost affordable, because, obviously hiring an individual coach or consultant can get really expensive. I wanted to have something that was really accessible in these times, that was still high value, but was lower cost, and allow them to find the kinds of ideas and support and training and coaching at a sort of level that they could afford. And so I launched this community. It's basically a community where you get some monthly training relevant to topics that are happening right now, or that are important right now around engagement. It's a community where you can connect with peers, and there's kind of a group coaching component of it as well. So I'm excited about that, and there's information about that on my website if people want to check it out.
Got it. We'll put that in the show notes. I quickly want to go the top 3. What's your favorite business book?
Probably my favorite business book of all time is Fierce Conversations by Susan Scott. It's I've read it probably 4 times, and I learned something every time.
Got it. And do you follow any HR leader or CEO whom you admire?
I tend to not follow specific people. It's more organizations and what they're doing. But one of the guys I would call out is Richard Sheridan. He runs a company called Menlo Innovations, has written a couple of books. I really admire what he's done with his organization.
Got it. And as I mentioned earlier, we're recording this during the COVID times. What is one piece of advice you give to young HR leaders who are graduating out of P schools, who are stepping into the HR field? What advice would you give to them?
I think study human behavior and psychology and social sciences more than you study best practices, because the more you understand how people operate and how people are motivated and how they work, and can connect that back to how to help them do better work, you're going to be better positioned than studying how we've done HR for the last couple of decades, because we haven't always gotten it right.
Right. Got it. And Jason, what is the best way people can reach out to you and know more about your work?
Sure. my website is the best place to find me, Jason Lauritsen. It's Lauritsen is my last name. Or just hit me with an email at jason@jasonlauritsen.com. I'm pretty easy to catch up with and engage with. And if you reach out, I will reach back and happy to field any questions.
Got it. We'll put that in the show notes. Jason, thank you so much for taking our time and speaking to us. I really enjoyed having a conversation.
Absolutely. Thanks for the invitation.
Thanks for listening to Vantage HR Influencers Podcast. Please do subscribe to Vantage HR Influencers Podcast on Apple Podcasts and Spotify for new episodes.